Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Amanda Kramer, and I am the Associate Director of Alumni Engagement at the University of Colorado Boulder's Leeds School of Business. Welcome back to our first quarterly Leeds Professional Development webinar since we pivoted and started hosting COVID-19 webinars in March of 2020. We are so excited to be here with you today. Leeds is a top business school offering undergraduate, MBA, executive MBA, MS, and PhD programs, and has an alumni network of over 41,000 strong, living and working around the world. For today's Leeds Professional Development webinar, we're so excited to welcome Dr. Jennifer Bone, who is here presenting Gender, Communication, and Leadership Norms in U.S. Business. A few housekeeping items before we begin. First, if you have any questions now or during the presentation that you would like to ask Jennifer, please send a question through the Q&A interface. We will monitor questions as they are submitted, and Jennifer will respond to them at the end of the presentation. As a reminder, for optimum audio quality, we do have everyone on mute except for myself and our speaker. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, please notify us through the chat interface and one of our support specialists will touch base. Lastly, a link to access the webinar recording will be sent to all registrants tomorrow, along with the survey link and supplemental resources from today's presentation. Now, I'm excited to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Jennifer Bone is an associate teaching professor at the Leeds School of Business at the University of Colorado at Boulder. She received her PhD from the University of Colorado Boulder, her MA from Colorado State University, and her BA from Cornell University. Jennifer's research examines how communicative practices and cultural norms restrict marginalized groups from leadership advancement. Specifically, she focuses on conflict management and negotiation practices and communicative norms in leadership. In addition, Jennifer has taught a number of communication-related courses, including gender and communication, communication strategy, essential management skills, business writing and communication, public speaking, introduction to human communication, argumentation and deliberation, and communication pedagogy. Welcome, Jennifer, and thank you so much for being here. I'm going to hand the webinar over to you now.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you for having me here today. I am excited to be here to talk about my research and understanding of communication, gender, and how that influences leadership. So let's go ahead and get started. 267. Do you have any guesses as to what this number represents? According to the Global Gender Gap Index, it will take another 267 years to close the gender gap in economic participation and opportunities for women globally. And when it comes to the United States ranking on gender equity in the labor market, we currently rank 30th. This means that 29 other countries outrank the United States when it comes to providing women equitable economic participation and opportunities for work. So there is some room to improve. My talk today addresses some of the reasons for this ranking, reasons that are not often discussed or acknowledged. These reasons include biases and stereotypes that exist in our communication patterns and societal norms based on a person's gender. So today, I will introduce perceptions of gender roles and norms in US culture, explain how gender styles of communication shape our understanding of effective leadership, discuss how stereotypes of gender norms continue to persist in US business, and offer strategies for more effective communication and leadership practices. First, I want to make sure that everyone understands what we mean when we say the term gender. The World Health Organization defines gender as the characteristics of women, men, girls, and boys that are socially constructed. This means our language shapes our understanding of gender. And as a social construct, gender varies from society to society and can change over time, especially as our language and our perceptions of others change. I want to highlight the fact that our society historically has recognized two dominant genders, boys and girls, men and women. And we are now recognizing that there are more than two genders, and some people don't identify with any gender. For the purposes of this webinar, I am going to be referring mostly to cisgender perceptions. So let me explain what that means. Cisgender represents a person whose sense of personal identity and gender correspond with their birth sex. For example, I identify as being cisgender. My gender identity aligns with the sex I was assigned at birth. So today, I will talk mostly about the two dominant gender constructions in the United States and how we understand what defines a person as masculine and what defines a person as feminine, and explain how this influences our perceptions that we bring into the workplace. I also want to acknowledge the importance of intersectionality. Intersectionality is basically understanding that social categories, things like our race, sexuality, socioeconomic status, and gender, all shape our experiences and make us unique. So the experiences that one woman faces at work may be very different from the experience that another woman faces at the same workplace. And this is likely the result of the intersections of identity that shape our perceptions and others' perceptions of us. Okay, let's begin with a look at the current representation of gender in leadership positions. As you may be well aware, there is an underrepresentation of women in leadership. The McKinsey Lean In 2021 study finds that women occupy 48% of entry-level positions, but only 24% of C-suite positions. And while the lower representation of women in top leadership positions is problematic, the McKinsey report actually argues that the problem begins far before that last level of promotion. Women face something called the broken rung. This broken rung happens at the first promotion to management. So the problem isn't necessarily just getting women to the C-suite, it's getting women promoted at the first level of promotion. And at this level, 86 women are promoted for every 100 men. And as a result, men begin to immediately outnumber women at the manager level, which means there are far fewer women to promote to higher levels. The representation of women of color in leadership positions is even lower compared to white employees and men of color, which leaves women of color severely underrepresented at the top. And additionally, Asian women account for 1 in 15 women in entry-level positions here in the United States, but only 1 in every 50 women in the C-suite. So you may be wondering, why is there a lack of gender diversity in leadership? There are actually many reasons for a lack of gender diversity in leadership, including reasons of unconscious bias, and this starts happening during the hiring process, blatant discrimination, lack of mentoring opportunities for women and for women of color, family obligations, which intensified so much, especially for women during the pandemic, that a lot of women left the workforce. And finally, stereotypes with gender roles. And while many of you have likely heard about or maybe even familiar with the first 4 reasons mentioned on the slide, this webinar focuses on the communication patterns and gender roles that are established early, often during our childhood, that teach us about the perception of who we are as boys and girls, and then what that means later on for our career choices and opportunities. A KMPG study asked 3,000 US women, professional working women and college-age women, whether they were taught about leadership growing up. This was their response. 76%, or 3 out of 4 women, responded they wished they had learned about leadership growing up, but instead they remember mostly being taught to be nice. And only 34% of women were taught to share their point of view and were encouraged to speak up and to speak their mind. And if this is the case, then we need to look at the messages that girls are receiving growing up that may not align well with learning to be a leader. To do this, we need to ask questions like, what do children learn when they grow up with labels, toys, and activities that are associated with their gender? A lot, actually. Believe it or not, we start communicating our understanding of gender from the moment a child is born. When we wrap our newborn babies in pink and blue blankets, we begin using gender language when we talk to them and when we talk about them. There was a classic study done in 1974 that showed that just within 24 hours of birth, parents responded to their babies in terms of gender stereotypes. Parents would describe girls as small, quiet, delicate, or she's just a really good girl, and would describe boys as being strong and big, active, and he's really alert. This study was replicated again in 2009, and the studies were pretty much the same. Parents continue to refer to girls as sweetheart in the study and as boys as like little men. And the label little man actually refers to a child behaving in association with manly characteristics, things like independence and assertiveness. And sweetheart, on the other hand, represents someone who is delicate or maybe fragile or even sweet. In addition to the labels we use to describe girls and boys, parents also communicate differently when talking to their sons and daughters. And since this is a webinar for the Leeds School of Business, you may find this fact interesting. Research conducted within the past decade shows that parents call more attention to numbers with their sons than they do with their daughters. Parents of young boys as young as 2 years old will talk about numbers and how to recognize numbers with their sons more than they talk about numbers to their daughters. This is pretty interesting. The labels we use to describe boys and girls help shape their initial understanding of their gender identity. Labels are how children first learn what is expected of them and how to behave according to their ascribed gender. The second place to look to understand how children learn about their gender roles and norms in our society is through the different types of play and activities in which they engage. As boys and girls engage in play, they learn how to communicate and interact with other people. Different types of play require different forms of communication. So take a moment and think about the different games you played growing up, what you enjoyed playing. And then consider this. Playing house or Barbies or other make-believe games requires a lot of cooperative communication. To keep a make-believe game of house going, for example, requires that those involved agree to the rules of communication and how to get along and interact and cooperate. And since there's no winner or loser necessarily in a game of house, the goal is to keep the game going as long as possible. This type of play is about the interaction itself. It's about the conversation. It's about maintaining a really good relationship with the other person. And of course, this is the type of play that many girls spend time engaged in during their childhood. On the other hand, competitive sports, different types of play with formal rules, requires more direct communication with very clear instruction. This form of communication may also require the team to have a leader or a captain or somebody who acts as the boss. And this person ultimately keeps everyone in line, making sure they're focused and they're working on a common task. Competitive games are about skill and ability. The kids involved compete with and against one another, and they often keep score. The communication needed in order to win is usually direct, it's assertive, and maybe even aggressive at times. Many young children might actually call these boy games, especially at the park or the school playground. It would not be surprising to hear some boys tell girls that they can't play these games with them because, well, they're a girl. So think of all the phrases used as insults against girls' abilities to succeed in these competitive games. How many times have you heard someone tell a boy he throws like a girl as an insult? Or as I once listened to a dad tell his 8-year-old son, who was visibly upset after losing a football game, to go put a skirt on. Ultimately, this teaches young children about differences in power and influence. Boys and girls between the ages of 3 and 5 begin to understand their gender identity. Boys become increasingly likely to use direct communication that they learn during play. Statements like, run over there, or give me that. Girls learn that they are less effective communicators and influencers than boys, and instead often rely on more indirect or polite styles of speech to be nice and to cooperate. Both of these styles of play are often rewarded by parents based on their child's gender. So research shows that parents, and particularly white heterosexual parents, tend to reward verbal and physical activity in sons more than they reward those in their daughters. and reward interpersonal and polite social skills in their daughters more than their sons. And violating the gender norms associated with these different types of play and communication patterns, as I said before, can result in labeling and insults. Girls who are too direct in their communication approach may be labeled bossy. And if she's into competitive play, she may be labeled a tomboy. Boys who use tentative language or that cooperative language instead of direct language may be called a sissy, or something that references feminine characteristics, which is an insult to young boys. Finally, the third way to understand how children begin to recognize their gender and what it means in our culture is through the chores they are assigned growing up. Domestic chores, things like cooking and cleaning and caring for others, are often assigned to girls, whereas outdoor work, taking out the trash, mowing the lawn, or helping to fix things, is often assigned to boys. This also reinforces the notion about which domain, the public or the private domain, girls and boys most belong. So taking into account the labels we use to describe boys and girls, the communication patterns associated with the different play, and how we assign tasks to kids, teach them how to communicate. And from all of this, two distinct styles of communication have emerged. Deborah Tannen, a professor of sociolinguistics, coined the terms rapport and report styles of communication to best explain these different speech patterns. A rapport style of speech is about the interaction and building relationships, much like how I described playing the house and make-believe games. This style expresses concern for others, it seeks advice, and it often includes tag questions and qualifiers, things that might make a person sound a little bit more tentative. So for example, I think that was a really good movie, didn't you? This type of speech is a way to include others into the conversation, but as I said before, is considered tentative or a little more uncertain. On the other hand, the report style of speech focuses in on direction, instruction, results, and outcomes, much like the competitive games. This style uses more direct requests, can provide advice, or seeks to solve problems. And can you guess which is the preferred style of communication for the workplace? These communication patterns matter because they shape our perceptions and expectations for how we identify others and how others, masculine and feminine individuals, should communicate. So let's take a look at a few of the common gender roles and stereotypes that are associated with gender. These lists are just the starting point for a long list of expectations that we have in our culture for cisgender folks. We expect individuals that we deem feminine to be collaborative, emotional, passive, cooperative, and nurturing. Individuals that we see as masculine, we expect to be more independent, emotionless, aggressive, competitive, and tough. And furthermore, we bring these same perceptions of gender communication and gender norms to work. Historically, we have placed higher value on leaders in business who engage in report talk and display masculine characteristics. And although this is now starting to change, we do continue to expect those in high-powered decision-making roles to be decisive, straightforward, and competitive. And that is not a bad thing. We actually need this in business. However, placing such high importance on report talk only limits our leaders' potential to display other important styles of communication. And when we place higher value on masculine traits than feminine traits, we ultimately devalue the feminine. Our society is now just beginning to talk about other important characteristics like vulnerability, empathy, and approachability as needed in our leaders. But it will take some time before the next generation of leaders really understand how to embody these practices. And here's the other problem. Because we have certain expectations for how leaders communicate, men who display masculine speech styles are often rated higher than women who display the same masculine speech styles. and it also influences who we believe to be more effective business leaders. A study conducted by the Pew Research Center in 2018 reports that masculine characteristics of being assertive, decisive, and ambitious helps men succeed in business more than these same characteristics help women. 7 in 10 Americans said being assertive and ambitious probably helps a man's chances of succeeding in business and politics more so than women. In fact, the characteristics that are believed to help women to succeed in business continues to revolve around her appearance and her compassion, two highly valued feminine characteristics that are often taught to girls at a young age. So the next thing to consider is how language influences perceptions of leadership qualities. So we ask, how does the language we use to describe others impact our perceptions of leaders and leadership? To begin, a McKinsey & Company study surveyed 132 companies and over 34,000 employees and found that women who negotiated for promotions, which likely included rapport style of communication, were 30% more likely than men to be labeled as intimidating, bossy, or aggressive. Remember, the broken rung is about the number of women who are not being promoted at the first level, probably around the time they're negotiating for their first salary increase. And labels based on perceptions of gender are not just given during times of negotiation and promotion. Labels based on gender stereotypes are also given during annual performance evaluations. A large-scale military study of over 4,000 participants and 81,000 performance evaluations examined both objective and subjective performance measures. And the military is actually an important study to evaluate gender bias, as it is a long-standing and traditionally male profession that has, over the past several decades, worked to eliminate formal gender segregation and discrimination. Interestingly, the analysis found almost no gender differences in objective measures like grades, fitness scores, and class standing, but significant gender differences in the subjective evaluations. This study looked at a list of 89 positive and negative leadership attributes that were used to assess a person's leadership performance. And although the number of positive attributes used to describe both men and women were quite similar, the labels assigned with them were based on gender stereotypes. So the most common positive term to describe a man was analytical, and for women, it was compassionate. So both analytical and compassionate reflect positively on the individual being evaluated. However, the term analytical is task-oriented. It speaks to the person's ability to reason, to interpret, to strategize, which are all important objectives to the mission of any business. Compassion, on the other hand, is relationship-oriented, and it can contribute to a positive work environment and culture, but perhaps is less valued in terms of accomplishing the work at hand. On the negative side, women were assigned significantly more negative attributes than men. The most commonly used negative term to describe men was arrogant. For women, it was inept. And I want to note that another study examining feedback provided in the workplace revealed that lesbian and bisexual women receive similar amounts of positive feedback as heterosexual women, but they were more likely to hear negative feedback, and that feedback was related to how they presented themselves at work, being told often that they were too outspoken and confrontational. Going back to the aforementioned negative characteristics, the author of this study asked the question of considering with the negative terms arrogant and inept, who is likely to be retained and who is more likely to be fired? An arrogant employee may negatively impact the work environment, but likely can accomplish the job. An inept person, by contrast, is clearly not qualified and presumably will be the person who is the one to be let go. These labels reinforce the stereotypes we have at work for the roles that men and women should play. And although I have spent time highlighting problems associated with feminine norms, I want to acknowledge that there are problems associated with the masculine norms we have as well. The language we use to describe and evaluate potential future leaders is important. Unfortunately, the language continues to reinforce stereotypes for both men and women that could be harmful to their professional and personal lives. In some cases, the environment created by this masculine ideal leave male leaders feeling oftentimes isolated and burdened to always have all of the answers, to not have to ask questions, to win at all costs. Men who are subjective at a young age to the gender stereotypes I previously mentioned often believe that they must be dominant, in control at work, especially to uphold the perceptions of what it means to be manly or to be a powerful leader. These types of toxic messages about men's responsibilities at work, using phrases like winning isn't everything, it's the only thing, teach men that they must be self-reliant, independent, and tough at all times. And messages men receive emphasizing autonomy, risk-taking, and emotional control can create a barrier to asking for help. This creates a perfect storm for decreased mental and physical health. The other stereotype men face is that they must be the breadwinner or the financial supporter for their families. Many men are raised to believe that their identity is tied to their income levels, which cause many men to put work ahead of families, to not request family leave time, or to take much needed PTO days. The pressure to maintain high levels of financial stability creates added strain, especially during times of economic recessions. And unfortunately, suicide rates for men is 3 times higher than among women. And while there are many reasons for this, studies do show that employment and monetary factors play a big role in leading especially middle-aged men to suicide. Sociologist Kristen Myers stated in her study that job loss for men is often synonymous with a loss of their masculinity. And for women, there continues to be common stereotypes in the workplace that hinder their performance and potential advancement. There is this expectation that women be the caretaker at work. Compared to men at the same level, women managers are providing more support to their teams, helping employees manage their workloads, and checking in regularly on their overall well-being. Senior level women are twice as likely as senior level men to spend time, substantial time even, on DEI work that falls outside their formal job responsibilities. And this includes recruiting employees from underrepresented groups and supporting employee resource groups. Sheryl Sandberg said on a recent podcast that women are not only expected to do a majority of the housework at home still, they are also expected to do a majority of the office housework. She asks, when you're in a meeting, who most often takes the notes? When it's someone's birthday, who do you think most often brings the cupcakes or acknowledges the birthday? It's mostly women. And what this does is this expectation takes away from women participating in the meeting or focusing on their job assigned tasks. Julia Wood, a professor of communication and gender studies, defines the third stereotype. She states that women in the workforce who are perceived as independent, ambitious, competitive, or tough are labeled often the Iron Maiden, or what we might reference, the bitch. These are the women who speak up, use the rapport style of communication, and display more masculine characteristics. They are then perceived as difficult and difficult to work with. So stereotypes for women and men can negatively impact their professional and personal lives. So it's finally time to ask, how can we overcome the gender stereotypes that exist in the workplace? One place to start, and as written in the 2021 Women in the Workplace report, we need to acknowledge that no single story can capture the range and diversity of women and men's experiences. Women and men have multiple and intersecting identities which profoundly shape their experiences at work. So it is critical that companies and leaders are aware of these dynamics so that they can effectively promote equity and inclusion for all employees. I do believe paying attention to our bias in our language is the first step to allowing more women the opportunity to be evaluated fairly and not according to gender expectations and stereotypes. we can be aware of our own biases and work to reduce them. How we label people and situations affects how we perceive them. So pay attention to the terms you use to describe women and other genders to be sure that you are focusing mostly on skills, competencies, and capabilities in a way that's more gender neutral, or at least using labels in similar ways for all employees. Psychologist Sandra Bem argued that characteristics associated with masculinity and femininity are actually not diametrically opposed. She used the term androgynous to refer to individuals who can employ both masculine and feminine characteristics. Androgynous individuals are more skilled at adjusting their communication style to be effective in varied situations. So looking ahead, androgynous leadership can be the most appropriate style for achieving high performance in organizations and for building positive working relationships. Valuing task-oriented and relationship-oriented communication will ultimately benefit the organization by creating a positive climate for innovation, fairer performance evaluations, and more equitable opportunities for advancement. So then, why doesn't everyone practice androgynous leadership? Well, one reason is because of the potential penalties associated with enacting behaviors that are gender incongruent. And it takes time, discipline, and self-awareness to intentionally disrupt habitual behaviors. Many leaders do not believe they have the time or that mental capacity to look at a situation and explicitly select the behavior that will be most effective. Yet this is exactly the focus that our leaders should have. Finally, providing training opportunities for women and all employees actually on how to help understand more leadership effectiveness through trainings on emotional intelligence, diversity and inclusion, and different communication strategies can really be helpful. There are also other strategies we can use to help repair that broken rung and promote women to leadership positions at much higher rates. So here's a few things that we can begin to do. First, to take time to pause and listen before responding in meetings and when interacting with others, especially for our leaders. This allows women to be able to speak up and to be heard. For the leader, this action can be perceived as that person being approachable, respectful, curious, and also demonstrating value of others. To pay attention to written communication, you can begin to analyze your own written feedback, the written communication of others in emails, reports, and on performance reviews. Analyzing written communication is easier than verbal speech since it can be asynchronous and not in real time. You can go back and look at it. It's also important to establish a workplace culture that will allow employees the opportunity to speak up if they're seeing bias in written communication. Ask for feedback. Assign a trustworthy colleague of yours to be what we call the communication process person, and have them let you know how your communication is being perceived, and potentially to provide suggestions on how to better adapt and adjust as needed. And finally, reframe language. Look for ways to reframe to be less uncertain or tentative. So for example, if you're given a project using a software you're not familiar with, instead of acknowledging, I'm not familiar with using that software, you can reframe to say, I look forward to using that software for the first time and learning more about it. Only then will we appreciate all the ways employees bring value to the workplace. If we want to bring more diversity to leadership, break down gender stereotypes, and repair that broken rung, we need to accept diversity in communication patterns. While we can't go back and change the labels we use to describe children at their birth, we can dismantle the labels that we use at work. And when we use communication fairly and avoid stereotyping others based on perceived gender norms, we can pave the way to gender parity in leadership. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for that great information, Jennifer. And now we're going to move into Q&A. So we invite attendees who are on and listening to the webinar, please submit any questions that you have through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And we will ask as many questions as we have time for here So let's get started. So the first question is from Kelsey, who asks, what are the steps to overcome fear and confront someone in a situation at work while also being compassionate?
I like that compassionate part as well. So my response here would be to employ both the report and rapport styles of communication that I just talked about. But there's something else here that I think can be really helpful. It's called perception checking. And perception checking is actually a 3-step process that we can use, especially if we want to confront someone or if we need to have these difficult conversations with others, coworkers, and so forth. And the 3 steps are the following. First, you start with a fact. You state a fact that is observable, something that wouldn't be in dispute between the people involved in this conversation. So you start with the fact. Then you go to the effects of that fact according to your perception. So how does that make you feel? What is the result for you? What is your interpretation of that fact? And the third step is to then provide that person an opportunity to respond. And it could be an explanation, or it could be a way that you are working to resolve that issue together. So for example, let's say I'm person A and I'm speaking to person B who has repeatedly been late with deadlines, and being late with this deadline is causing me to submit my work late as well. So this approach with perception checking sounds something like this. Hi, person B. I've noticed that the last 2 reports you've submitted came in late. Fact, right? So that shouldn't be disputed. Fact. The second part, I am concerned about the deadlines with these reports because it made my report late, and I'm afraid my supervisor will be, concerned about this, or this will show up on my performance review. Okay, so that's my reaction. And the third step would be to engage that person. Has there been a reason why for you these reports have been late, or is there something I can do to help make sure that the reports are turned in on time next time? And it allows that person that opportunity to respond. So these are difficult conversations to have, especially when you want to call out certain behaviors that need to change. But to start with the fact, something that you can both agree on, how you're interpreting it or what that means for you, and then allow that other person to respond and engage in ways to move forward, or at least to provide their explanation, can show that compassionate side that this person was asking about in the question.
Great. Thank you so much for that clear explanation in terms of providing actionable next steps along with an example. That was really helpful. The next question is actually asking for an additional example. Rebecca's asking, could you share an example or two of the androgynous communication that you mentioned, thinking about it in the context of the workplace as you consider maybe an example or two?
Of the androgynous communication?
Yes.
Yeah, so it really is situational in terms of when it's necessary to use the report talk. When you're providing instructions to others, report talk is required because employees want clear instructions. It's one of the top 3 things that they say that they want from an effective leader: clear instructions. So that would be report. Tell me how to do it. Tell me what you need to be done. But then the rapport style would be switching to allow the other person that's involved an opportunity to participate in the decision making. So is there any other ways in which you can see this report being done more successfully? To engage in the opportunities for others to be more involved and included in the conversation. So it is varied for sure. We do need both. It depends on whether the situation requires for report talk, so very clear instructions and ways to solve problems, versus brainstorming or allowing other people to be part of that conversation in that decision-making role, which would then be something where you'd want to insert the rapport style.
Great. Thank you very much for that. Wonderful. Next, we have a question from Tori, who asks, how do you separate individual emotion and opinion from discussions and decisions at work or in business?
Emotions and decisions, emotions and opinions.
Yes,
okay.
That's right.
So I look at this as being actually 2 parts, because emotion is a big one. And when, we talk a lot about emotional intelligence in the Lead School of Business, and one of the principles of emotional intelligence is self-regulation. And that means being able to have control over the emotions that you may be experiencing. And this also can take some time. And there is another 3-step process here to help to regulate emotions and to stay in check when you feel the need. So quickly, the 3 steps would be: first, to regulate, which means that you don't respond immediately. So if you're in a meeting, this would be pausing. It's where you could take a deep breath. It might be counting to 10. It might be allowing other people to speak up first. If you're not in a meeting and you're in a situation where you can move away from the computer or from the email and physically walk to allow your time to process, that's helpful. So step 1 is to regulate. Step 2 is to reflect. There are always multiple ways that we can respond to any situation, and we need to take time to think about what those options are. And so if you tell yourself as you're reflecting that you need to come up with 3 possible different ways to respond, it usually puts you into a position of having to understand better the other person's point of view, why that moment happened, what would the other person say is really going on the other side. And so when you're reflecting on your different options for responding, now you're starting to, those emotions start to come down. And then the 3rd step is to respond once you've selected the most appropriate way to reflect. So self-regulation takes a lot of time. Definitely that pausing piece is really crucial as you think about the different options. The opinion part to this question is interesting because I believe, especially for women, they are afraid to recognize the opinions that they have. But I would say a couple of things to this. How is it that you have come to hold that opinion? And is it based on your own personal experience or things that you have observed? Because that means that you have this basis to share an opinion based on something that has happened. And maybe it doesn't happen to everyone. Maybe it's just your own personal, experience with a situation, but it is valid. And so opinions are valid. The other part is to whether or not it's an assumption that you're making. And if it's the assumption, then I would go back to that perception checking of saying, here's the fact, like this situation happened. This is how I'm making an assumption or interpretation about it. Is this how other people are seeing it? Or is this something that needs to be addressed on a higher level? So I don't know if that's answering it clearly, but in terms of the emotion, the self-regulation technique can be helpful. And then in terms of opinions, I think if you can say, here are some facts that help me form this opinion, that's also as helpful, as needed.
Great. No, that was very comprehensive, and I think absolutely addresses the question that was asked. So thank you very much for that. Next, we have a 2-part question. So I'll read it slowly. It's a question from Hillary. First part, what are some training resources that people can seek out beyond the examples given? Number 1, as parents, to ensure we are raising empowered children through gender positive communication. So that's the first piece. The second piece would be if we want deeper training as leaders to better learn androgynous communication.
Yeah, there are lots of different resources for parents now. It's been, I have started talking about this topic close to 20 years ago now. And I just remember thinking there wasn't a lot of research done. And but now if you start to search for raising, if you non-binary could be another term to look up, so that it helps to collect resources that are focusing specifically on that androgynous piece of embracing both the masculine and the feminine qualities. So looking up certain information online, I think there's just so much now that you're going to find. There are some training for the workplaces now that leaders, there's so much training that's being offered now. There are consulting groups that come in and talk about things like emotional intelligence that can help with leadership effectiveness. And part of that is some information that I talked about earlier today. The other point in terms of the communication, the androgynous style, one of the things that gets lumped in with that I think is really important for leaders to consider is cross-cultural training in communication. So we are in this global society now where we are working with people either in our office from other cultures, or we're working remotely with people who are living in a different culture. And there's so much to be learned from understanding the different styles of communication, both verbal and nonverbal, between cultures. And so when we're talking about both the report and rapport styles of speech, that's important for sure. But then to add another layer to that, we need to think about how different cultures reflect and respond and communicate that might be different than what we do here in the dominant United States. So nonverbal communication is different between cultures. Different expectations for gender is even more rigid in other cultures. And we need to start to understand those differences and nuances in order to communicate effectively with our colleagues that are familiar with a different culture, or our customers and clients that are living outside of the dominant US as well. So I think these training and resources are just so important for companies to consider implementing. So the education piece is huge.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that. And that the culture piece is actually a great segue into this next question that we received from Kirsten, who asked, how can a female leader communicate and work with male coworkers who come from cultures that don't have females in leadership?
Yeah, okay. So that's a big one. And it's a tough one to solve right away. So I look at this in two ways. First, I think having these cross cultural communication training sessions is important for everyone to take at work, because a lot of times the burden is left on the woman to educate the other members of her team, or to try to establish her authority or her credibility based on just a lack of understanding, or the interactions that especially men from other cultures may have when it comes to women in leadership positions. And I don't think the burden should always fall on the woman or on the leader. I think this is something that the entire company needs to be invested in terms of the education piece with all employees. So whether it's part of an onboarding training for new employees, or whether it gets put into sort of if your company has annual staff meetings and things like that, you can incorporate it there. So I think it's bigger than just one person trying to figure out how to make male colleagues from a different culture further respect her. But there are some things, again, in understanding differences between cultures that can be helpful. So it depends on what culture the people are from that you are working with. There are different sort of expectations for how we engage in communication. So for some cultures, women shouldn't look directly at men and maintain extended eye contact with men. And so is there a practice where you could still be a leader and refrain from constant, long, extended eye contact? Or things about rules of touch and distance that needs to be held between people? So understanding the cultural norms for the person that you're working with can help you perhaps better relate to that person in an office setting, just by being able to adapt and adjust a little bit as needed. But again, I think that it's something that companies just need to make employees more aware of, because the burden shouldn't always be falling on the women to do that education piece and to change behaviors to accommodate.
Thank you. That absolutely makes sense. Great. Well, taking a look at the time here, we're going to move into our final question from Christina, who said, is there a positive way to engage with someone who is explaining something to you that you've already said, either moments or days ago?
Okay, I love this question. And I have a feeling others may be wanting to ask the same question. Okay, so first of all, if there is a nice and polite way using some of the perception checking steps that I've mentioned before. So it's about fact. So it's report, rapport. So this is what it does. It's addressing the fact that you have already stated that, or that it was your idea that was brought to the table first, but then welcoming an opportunity for that other person to explain why they repeated it. So for example, again, I'll just use person A and person B. If I'm person A and I had this great idea that I shared at a meeting yesterday, and now person B is repeating that same idea in today's meeting, I could say something like, oh, I brought that idea up at yesterday's meeting. Fact. And then the question becomes along the lines of, was there something that you wanted to add to that idea to extend the thinking on this? Or were you there? Did you hear me talk about this as I elaborated on this, key piece of information? And what that does is it makes you less defensive so that you're not sitting there going, that was my idea, but rather saying, hey, acknowledge the fact I brought that up and I'm curious why you're bringing it up now. And so to put that back onto person B by saying, is there something you wanted to add? Another idea that you have to extend, this idea could be a way to get credit for the idea that you had initially, and also call attention to the other person who's trying to now take ownership over it. So report, fact that you said it, rapport, engaging in a question of, do you want to talk a little bit more about your extension of this idea?
That's so great. Thank you for reemphasizing that rapport and giving the example, because I think so often in the workplace, it's easy to immediately feel defensive, and maybe not know how to proceed with that feeling. So it was really
And I
great to
want to
have that.
highlight with this question, this is a gender phenomenon. And there is study after study that show that men interrupt women more often in meetings. And so I don't know if that was the reasoning for this question or not, but it is really important that women especially begin to speak up and take ownership of the ideas and the things that they are contributing at work, and not letting other people take over those ideas.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing us back to that point here as we close. And we want to say thank you so much to everyone for joining us for today's presentation, and a special thank you again to you, Jennifer, for this great information. At this time, we ask those that are still on the webinar to please provide your feedback on the webinar by answering the following poll question. On a scale from 1 to 10, how likely are you to recommend this webinar to a friend or fellow Leeds alumni? We thank you in advance for submitting your feedback. As a reminder, all webinar attendees will receive an email tomorrow with a link to the recording of this presentation as well as a survey. To view upcoming webinars as well as previous recordings, please visit our website at colorado.edu/business/alumni. We look forward to seeing you at our next webinar, which will be in Q1 2022. In the meantime, have a great rest of your day. Thank you for your time, and go Buffs.